Greetings, my friends, and welcome back to the YouTube channel Ascent of Mount Carmel. You might consider this channel your online Cliff Notes for the book Ascent of Mount Carmel. Today we're discussing the first chapter of Book 1 of Ascent of Mount Carmel. Most of the chapters devoted to the outline of the book. St. John of the Cross tells us that the first of the three books of Ascent of Mount Carmel explain the nature of the dark night and how it is necessary to pass through it to achieve divine union. And in particular, this book, Book 1, describes the dark night of the senses. We have to take away the bright neon lights and empty ourselves of all that is of this world so that we can create an empty space so that God may then come to us and fill that empty space. Do you remember that science fiction movie from 1980 called Altered States? It starred William Hurt. In that movie, the lead character went into a sensory deprivation tank. It was a coffin-sized chamber from which he was cut off from any outside stimulus. He was floating in water so that he could not feel touch, he could not hear, he wore something over his eyes so he could not see.
In the basement of one of the country's leading medical schools, Dr. Edward Jessup, candidate for a Nobel Prize, is conducting the most dangerous experiment in the history of science. And the subject of the experiment is himself.
And in that movie, strange and miraculous things came to him. It went into the realm of science fiction, and it's kind of departed from reality. It seems that the screenplay writer understood that by depriving ourselves of senses of the outside world, we can become open to greater things. In the first chapter, St. John provides us with the first stanza of his poem, The Dark Night of the Soul. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, O happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. St. John explains, in this first stanza, the soul sings of the happy fortune and chance which it experienced in going forth from all things that are without, meaning the things of the world, and from the desires or appetites and imperfections that are in the sensual part of man. And just to clarify, the sensual part of man refers to all pleasures of the senses, not just sexual pleasures. So as we noted earlier, the dark night is not a crisis of faith. In fact, once we darken ourselves to the things of this world, it enables us to be kindled in love with yearnings, O happy chance. St. John tells us, for a soul to attain the state of perfection, it has to ordinarily first pass through two principal kinds of night, which spiritual persons call purgations or purifications of the soul, and here we call them nights, for in both of them the soul journeys, as it were, by night in darkness. St. John adds, and this first night pertains to beginners, occurring at a time when God begins to bring souls into the state of contemplation. Elsewhere in this book, St. John tells us that he was planning to write a fourth book for beginners. Now, I'm only guessing, but I suspect that when he was done with the first draft of the book, he decided that the first book was adequate for beginners and then went back and made some edits. But he forgot to delete the plan for a future book for beginners. As noted earlier, St. John seemed to be planning on breaking down each stanza of the poem, but then he stopped doing that, at least directly, after a few chapters. The point that I'm making is that if St. John had had the ability to write this book with a word processor, there'd be probably some very minor changes and edits, not dealing with the substance of the book. So the first book is for beginners. St. John adds, the second night, or purification, pertains to those who are already proficient, occurring at a time when God desires to bring them to the state of union with God. So that means we have a mere 15 chapters to go from beginners to being proficient. So we'll take some time to deal with issues about what level of detachment we need to achieve. However, St. John mentions the level of detachment already in this chapter. The soul is being led by God for love of Him alone, which is the privation and purgation of all its sensual desires, with respect to all outward things of the world, and to those which were delectable to its flesh, and likewise with respect to the desires of its will. And the will be discussed later in the book. So St. John is telling us we need to purge all our sensual desires, and that's a very tough benchmark for us to reach. Please note that St. John tells us in the coming chapters that it is possible to have material things. However, what is important is to not have an attachment to them. If all of this sounds very daunting, we should remember that all things are possible with the grace of God. As St. John himself says, for of itself the soul would not have succeeded on its own,
because no man by himself can succeed in voiding himself of all his desires in order to come to God. This chapter was discussed by the Ascent of Mount Carmel group, which is a Facebook group, and one of the members mentioned that he had found that reading The Spiritual Combat alongside these chapters on detachment has been a great help in understanding the methodology of detaching from the sensory appetite. It's his opinion that these first chapters are the most challenging because they involve at times rigorous applications of self-denial to subordinate the flesh to the spirit. We'll talk more about that in coming chapters. But until then, please check out the Ascent of Mount Carmel Facebook group, which is linked down below. Also, please check out my Facebook page, which is linked down below. And please pray for the church.